After many long years of hype, Star Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi is here at last. The first two episodes are already out, and we'll be discussing spoilers from both of them, especially the second in this video, so be sure to go watch those episodes first. We'll be waiting for you when you get back.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The second episode of Kenobi took us to the planet Dayu, a world shrouded in smog and covered in decaying urban zones. Dayu was a poverty-stricken world, a place where spice dealers could sell their goods out in the open, and the very air was filled with desperation. It reminded us a lot of Nar Shaddaa, the great slum of Hutt space. We got to see plenty of unfortunate characters on Dayu, but the one that stood out the most was one you probably never expected to see. A homeless clone trooper begging for credits in the street. It was a sad sight, but it begs the question, how many other clones ended up like this? What happened to the veterans of the Clone Wars? By the time Kenobi is set, the first generations of clones would be 23 years old, making them 46 years old physically. Clone production had long since ceased, and thus, clone troopers were slowly dying out. Truth be told, the poor clone we see in Kenobi was likely struggling with more than just poverty and homelessness. PTSD from the Clone Wars aside, clones tended to suffer degradation as they aged, especially clones whose aging had been accelerated. Because of their artificial nature and higher metabolisms, clones started mentally and physically deteriorating at a much younger age than normal humans. Since most of the Empire didn't have universal healthcare, homeless clones likely had plenty of problems they weren't getting any treatment for. But how common were the clones like the one from Kenobi? Unfortunately, they were probably all too common too. During the Clone Wars, separatist propagandists liked to claim that the Republic would hand captured separatist worlds over to the clones to be ruled by the law of the blaster after the war. But in reality, it never planned on doing anything of the kind. Truth be told, the Republic didn't even have a plan for what to do with the clones after the war. In canon, the Empire didn't have much of a plan for old clones either. They were left to the mercy of the galaxy. The clones of the Grand Army of the Republic were all slaves. It's not separatist propaganda. They were legally state property of the Republic and later the Empire. As a result, clones didn't get paid and they sure as hell didn't get benefits from their jobs. All the Republic and early Empire cared about was keeping the clones alive and in fighting condition. However, as we've seen in Star Wars The Bad Batch, the Empire didn't wait long before beginning to phase out clone troopers. It's important to understand that the Empire didn't just phase out clones because the higher-ups had concerns about loyalty or effectiveness. Those were largely just excuses. The main reason why the Empire phased out clones was essentially racism. The clones were produced by the non-human Kaminoans after all, and on top of that, the Imperial doctrine of humanocentrism saw clones, as well as cyborgs and other groups seen as only partly human, as inferiors. Unfortunately for the clones, this bigotry not only cost them most of their jobs, but also any chance at a half-decent future. It's doubtful that the canon Empire gave their clones any sort of severance packages or anything like that. Honestly, it's kind of astonishing that they actually let the clones live after phasing them out of the Stormtrooper Corps. As we saw in Kenobi, not even the men of the 501st got any benefits. The clones were just cast out, and in most cases they were left with nowhere to go. Those who found jobs likely ended up as hired muscle. After all, the clones were bred to be soldiers, and they had never been taught how to do anything that wasn't relevant to a soldier's life. This lack of exchangeable skills is likely what rendered our friend on Dayu, as well as many other clones, homeless and penniless. There's been a bit of speculation going around as to whether the homeless clone on Dayu had an inhibitor chip or whether he'd removed it. If that's something you're wondering, the answer is yes. He almost definitely still had an inhibitor chip, as did all but a dozen clones. This may seem like an irrelevant issue, but it likely would have twisted the knife even further for those clones who ended up in really bad shape. Star Wars The Clone Wars revealed that the inhibitor chips gave clones recurring nightmares even when they were inactive. For clones facing all manner of other stresses, especially those with PTSD, this would have made life all sorts of miserable. The clone we saw in Dayu and Kenobi is the only example we have of a homeless, castaway clone so far, but we have a pretty good idea of what became of clones like him regardless. After all, you don't need to fight in a war to lose everything to it. Many civilians lost everything they had in the Clone Wars, and many ended up in the exact same circumstances as the clone on Dayu. Some populations lost entire cities to the war, some lost their entire homeworlds. If you were unlucky enough to be from, for example, Humberine, which had its crust melted into slag by orbital bombardment during the war, you wouldn't just end up without a home if you happened to be off-world during the bombing. you would end up without a home world. Every time there was a major war in the Star Wars universe, millions of beings ended up losing their homeworlds, becoming refugees with little to their name and no place to go. For all intents and purposes, clones discarded by the Empire would have been in the same boat. Those unfortunate enough to be out with a homeworld generally ended up at the mercy of the space lanes. They would end up on passenger liners and would stop on planets that sat at hyperspace junctions. More often than not, these were typically heavily urbanized planets like Coruscant, Denon, or Eridu. We would bet Dayu was also located at a galactic crossroads, and as a result, many of the galaxy's unfortunates ended up there. In the introduction, we compared Dayu to Nar Shaddaa, and not without cause, as it was located at a crossroads easy to get passage to and very hard to leave. In Legends, after the Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War, millions of refugees ended up trapped on Nar Shaddaa, where local criminal outfits herded them into a filthy sector on the dark side of the moon. Some of these people were trapped in the refugee sector for over a decade, harassed by thugs from the Exchange crime syndicate on one side and a gang of veterans on the Battle of Sirocco on the other. The Exchange and the Hutts regularly preyed on the refugees, kidnapping them to sell into slavery on Hutt spice worlds or just harassing them for fun. While the story of the Nar Shaddaa refugee sector comes from Legends, we don't doubt that the refugees of the Clone Wars, clone veterans included, fared similarly in canon. The Empire didn't care about their plights. The cults of power that ruled the Empire held that those who ended up in such terrible conditions were weak and deserved their fate, even those who had bled to bring the Empire into being. The governments of some individual worlds, such as Alderaan, did what they could to help clone veterans and refugees of the Clone Wars, but for those unlucky enough to end up on Nar Shaddaa or Dayu, the chances that anyone in power would be willing to help were slim to none. It's important to remember that Star Wars is massive, and only the coolest stories make it to our screens. That said, the veterans most of us are used to seeing, such as Rex, Wolf, and the Commandos in Bad Batch, were the exception rather than the rule. For the vast majority of standard clones who still had their inhibitor chips and who weren't in a position to train new Imperial recruits like the Commandos and certain clone commanders like Cody were, they were simply tossed by the wayside and left to fend for themselves. The fact that the homeless clone we saw on Dayu was still alive 10 years after the Clone Wars is actually quite the achievement, since most would have unfortunately perished a lot sooner. So that was our rather depressing look at the fate of the veterans of the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Did you expect to see clones in Kenobi? Do you expect to see more? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, this is still quite a pressing issue today, so the team and I have included a couple links below to help fight homelessness. So if you can spare $1 or $2, go and check them out. Anyways, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.